The village of Evermore was quaint, tucked away between rolling hills and thick forests that swallowed up the edges of the world. The air there always seemed a little colder than in the towns nearby, as if the place clung to the last breath of autumn no matter the season. The locals were friendly, but in the way people are when they're trying to hide something. Anna noticed that from the first day she arrived. She had rented a small cottage at the edge of the village, where the forest loomed dark and still beyond her back door. It was a peaceful place, or it should have been. But something about Evermore kept her on edge, a tension she couldn't explain. At night, the wind howled through the narrow streets, rattling the window panes and making the house creak as though it were alive. It was during those late hours, in the silence between the gusts, that Anna first heard the whispers. At first, she dismissed them as a trick of her tired mind, worn out from unpacking and settling in. But as the days passed, the whispers grew clearer, though she could never quite catch the words. They were faint, barely there, yet they filled the empty spaces of her home when she was alone. She asked Mrs. Kettle, the elderly woman who lived next door, if the wind always sounded like that. Mrs. Kettle's face grew pale, her hands shaking slightly as she poured Anna a cup of tea. "Oh, she said, her voice just above a whisper. "The wind plays tricks here. Best not pay it much mind." Anna tried to take her advice, but it was hard to ignore when the whispers seemed to follow her everywhere. She could hear them when she walked through the village, felt them tugging at the edges of her thoughts even during the day. And then there was the figure. It started as a fleeting glimpse, a shadow moving just out of view. Anna had been walking back from the market one afternoon, arms full of groceries, when she saw something in the corner of her eye. A figure, pale and indistinct, standing among the trees just beyond the path. She stopped, turning her head, but it was gone. She told herself it was nothing, a trick of the light filtering through the leaves. But that night, as she lay in bed, she saw it again. Her bedroom window faced the forest, and through the thin lace curtains she could make out the dark line of trees swaying gently in the wind. But there, just beyond the edge of the clearing, a pale figure stood. Its face was hidden in shadow, but Anna could feel its gaze on her, cold and unrelenting. She sat up, heart pounding, her breath catching in her throat. The figure didn't move. She blinked, and in that split second it vanished. The whispers were louder now, creeping through the walls of her cottage like dampness seeping into the wood. Anna pressed her hands over her ears, but it did no good. The voices weren't outside. They were inside her head, soft and insistent. She could almost understand them now, but not quite. They spoke of something old, something buried deep within the heart of the village, though she didn't yet know what. The next morning, exhausted and unnerved, Anna went back to Mrs. Kettle. The old woman opened the door, eyes wary. "Have you ever seen someone outside?" Anna asked hesitantly. "Near the forest, maybe?" Mrs. Kettle's expression darkened, her lips thinning into a tight line. "Best not go looking where you don't belong," she muttered, avoiding Anna's gaze. "There are things in this village that are better left alone." Anna wanted to press her, but the look on the old woman's face warned her not to. Instead, she returned home with a growing sense of unease. That night, as the wind howled and the whispers rose to a fever pitch, Anna knew one thing for certain. She was no longer alone in her cottage. The figure had returned closer this time, watching her from the window. The days after that sighting blurred together. Anna slept fitfully, her nights filled with unsettling dreams of the pale figure and a voice calling her name, distant yet unmistakable. By day, she tried to keep herself busy, walking through the village, attempting to forget the eerie presence outside her window. But the whispers followed her, always faint, always there. It was as though the village itself was alive, breathing secrets into her ear. It wasn't long before she began to hear more about the village's past, not from the locals. They were tight-lipped, offering only vague warnings about leaving things be. But Anna's curiosity was already piqued. The figure at her window, the whispers in the night, they all pointed to something that had long been buried in Evermore's history. So she started asking questions, beginning with the small library in the town center. It was a dusty place, more of a forgotten relic than a true source of knowledge. But it was here that she found her first clue. In a corner, tucked away behind rows of old, unused books, she discovered a collection of yellowing news articles. As she flipped through them, one particular headline caught her eye. Tragic death of local woman, an unsolved mystery. The article told the story of Margaret Hale, a woman who had lived on the outskirts of the village nearly a century ago. Margaret, according to the report, had been found dead under mysterious circumstances, her body discovered near the forest line. The official cause of death had been ruled an accident, but rumors swirled around Evermore that something more sinister had happened. Some spoke of a betrayal by those she trusted. Others whispered of a terrible secret she had carried to her grave. What was most disturbing was that her resting place had never been marked. Her grave, if it existed, had long since been lost to time. As Anna read, a chill crawled up her spine. Margaret's description, the pale complexion, the long dark hair, seemed to match the figure she had seen watching her from the trees. Could it be her? Was the woman she had seen the restless spirit of Margaret Hale, seeking something from beyond the grave? That evening, Anna returned to her cottage with a new sense of purpose. If this spirit was Margaret Hale, perhaps she was trying to communicate, to tell her side of the story. But how could Anna reach her? As she pondered this, the whispers returned, swirling around her, louder than ever before. They seemed to beckon her outside, toward the forest. Grabbing her coat, Anna followed the pull of the voices into the night. The wind howled through the trees, but the whispers cut through the noise, guiding her deeper into the woods. The pale figure was nowhere to be seen, but the presence, Margaret's presence, was palpable, as though the air itself was heavy with her grief. Eventually, Anna came upon a small clearing. The earth here felt different, colder somehow, and the ground was uneven, as though something had once been buried and forgotten. She knelt down, running her hands over the dirt, and that's when she felt it. A rough stone, half buried beneath a layer of moss and roots. Anna brushed the dirt away, revealing the worn surface of what must have once been a grave marker. There was no name, no date, just a simple, unmarked slab. Her heart raced as the whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if the spirit was speaking directly to her now. "This is where you were laid to rest, isn't it?" Anna whispered into the cold night air, her breath visible in the moonlight. "What happened to you?" But the voices didn't answer. Instead, a deep silence fell over the clearing, as though the entire forest was holding its breath. Anna shivered and stood up, her eyes scanning the darkness. She felt the weight of unseen eyes on her again, and the urge to run tugged at her. Yet, she couldn't leave. Not now. She had disturbed something, uncovered something that had been hidden for too long. The unmarked grave, the whispers, the figure, they were all connected. But Margaret's story wasn't over. There was more to uncover, and Anna had the sinking feeling that whatever had wronged the woman in life wasn't finished with her in death. As she turned back toward her cottage, the wind picked up again, carrying with it a soft, mournful whisper that sent a shiver down her spine. "Find them," it breathed. The fog rolled into Evermore the next morning, thick and oppressive, swallowing the village in its cold, gray embrace. Anna could barely see the cottages across the narrow street, their familiar shapes now ghostly outlines shrouded in mist. It was as if the village itself had retreated, hiding from the truth she had unearthed the night before. She hadn't slept. The whispers had stayed with her all night, circling in her mind. Find them, they'd said. But who? Who was Margaret Hale speaking of? Anna felt as though she had only scratched the surface of something far more terrible than she could have imagined. She ventured out into the fog, her breath hanging in the air as she walked. The village felt different today, more isolated, more claustrophobic. The fog turned everything into shadow and suggestion, and as Anna moved through the empty streets, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. As she passed by the small village square, the sound of laughter echoed faintly through the fog, but it was distant, warped by the mist. She strained to listen, but the noise faded, leaving only an unsettling silence in its wake. She shivered and quickened her pace, her boots thudding softly against the cobblestones. She hadn't gone far when she saw it. The figure. The same pale, indistinct shape she had seen before, standing at the edge of the fog just down the road. For a moment it didn't move, just stood there, its form barely visible through the haze. But then it shifted, slowly, turning its head toward her. Though Anna couldn't see its face, she felt its gaze land on her, cold and piercing. A chill settled over her. She took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest. But when she blinked, the figure was gone. Just like that, it had vanished into the fog. Anna stood frozen for a long moment, her eyes darting around the mist-shrouded street, but there was no sign of the figure anywhere. She shook her head, trying to calm the rising panic in her chest. It couldn't have been real. It had to be her imagination, playing tricks on her in the fog. But deep down, she knew it was no trick. As she continued her walk, the fog seemed to press in closer, its damp fingers creeping into her bones. She kept her eyes fixed ahead, trying to ignore the way the village seemed to change around her, its familiar landmarks distorted by the mist. She passed the old church, its steeple barely visible through the fog, and then the village well, where the sound of trickling water was barely audible over the muffled silence. And then she saw another figure. This one was closer, standing just a few feet from the well. Unlike the pale, ghostly figure she'd seen before, this one was clearer, its features sharper in the mist. A man, dressed in clothes that looked too old for the present day, his face pale and gaunt as though he had been drained of life. Anna stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The man's eyes were fixed on her, empty and unblinking. She wanted to turn, to run, but her feet wouldn't move. And then, just as suddenly as before, the figure vanished, swallowed by the fog. Fear twisted in her gut as she hurried away from the well, her pulse quickening. The faces were becoming clearer now, their outlines more distinct with each passing minute. She saw them everywhere, in doorways, along the edges of the road, in the alleys that snaked between the cottages. Some were pale and ghostly like Margaret, their features blurred by time. Others were clearer, their expressions twisted in sorrow or anger, their eyes following her every move. By the time Anna reached her cottage, she was shaking. She slammed the door behind her, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers had grown louder now, the words almost intelligible. "You can't stay here," they hissed. "You must find them before they find you." Anna pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the voices, but they only grew louder, filling the small cottage with their mournful plea. She stumbled toward the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer outside. The fog still hung thick in the village, but there, at the edge of her garden, stood a figure, a woman, her long hair hanging limp around her face, her clothes tattered and covered in dirt. Margaret. Anna's breath caught as she locked eyes with the specter. This time there was no mistaking it. The woman from the grave was standing before her, silent and still, her eyes hollow and full of rage. But it wasn't directed at Anna. Margaret's gaze was fixed on something, or someone, just beyond the fog. With trembling hands, Anna closed the curtain and backed away from the window. She understood now. Margaret's vengeance wasn't blind. She wasn't after just anyone. The faces in the fog, they were the ones she wanted. And Anna was caught in the middle of something far more dangerous than she had realized. The fog had not lifted by morning. It clung to the village like a shroud, thick and heavy, casting evermore in an unearthly glow. Anna sat at her kitchen table, staring out the window, her mind racing. The face of Margaret Hale haunted her thoughts, that cold, relentless stare that seemed to pierce her very soul. But Margaret hadn't been looking at her, not truly. The spirit's vengeance was meant for someone else, someone still living. But who? Determined to uncover the truth, Anna gathered her coat and headed back into the fog. The whispers had quieted since last night, but the village felt different, more oppressive, as if the weight of the past was pressing down on it, suffocating the present. She needed answers, and she knew there was only one place to start. Mrs. Kettle had been in Evermore her whole life. If anyone knew the full story, it was her. Anna's knock echoed on the old woman's door, and after a long pause, Mrs. Kettle opened it just a crack, peering out with wary eyes. The tension between them hung in the air like the fog, thick and unresolved. "I need to know about Margaret Hale," Anna said quietly, her breath visible in the cold. "She's not at rest, Mrs. Kettle. Something terrible happened to her, and it's not over." For a moment, it seemed like the old woman would shut the door in her face. But then she sighed, the weariness of her years settling into her shoulders, and stepped aside to let Anna in. Inside, the cottage was dimly lit, the smell of herbs and old wood filling the air. Mrs. Kettle sat heavily in her armchair, her eyes fixed on the fireplace. "I told you before some things are better left alone," she muttered. "But you wouldn't listen, would you? Just like Margaret. Always asking too many questions." Anna's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" The old woman sighed again, deeper this time, and stared into the flames. "Margaret wasn't like the rest of us. She was headstrong, always pushing for answers where none were wanted. The village elders, well, they didn't take kindly to that. She found out things that were supposed to stay buried." "What kind of things?" Anna asked, leaning in. Mrs. Kettle hesitated, her gnarled fingers twisting in her lap. She learned about the old families, the ones who founded Evermore, the Hales, the Renshaws, the Cromwells. They weren't always honest folk. Deals were made, dark bargains that shouldn't have been struck. Her voice lowered to a whisper. Margaret uncovered the truth about those deals, and it cost her everything. Anna's pulse quickened. "They killed her, didn't they?" Mrs. Kettle didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked up at Anna, her eyes shining with an emotion that might have been fear. "They did worse than kill her," she said softly. "They made her disappear, buried her where no one would find her. And then they erased her from the village, made sure no one would speak her name again. A chill crawled up Anna's spine. The unmarked grave, the whispers. Margaret's face in the fog. It all made sense now. "But she's not gone," Anna said, her voice barely a breath. "She's still here, and she wants justice." Mrs. Kettle closed her eyes. "Justice," she repeated bitterly. "Or revenge. She doesn't care which." Anna stood abruptly, her mind spinning. The faces in the fog, the figures she'd seen, hadn't just been random spirits. They were the descendants of the families who had wronged Margaret, and they were still living in Evermore, pretending nothing had happened. "Who's left?" Anna demanded, her voice trembling with urgency. "Who's connected to those families?" Mrs. Kettle's eyes opened slowly, her expression grim. "Not many. Most left long ago, before the curse could touch them. But some stayed. The Cromwell boy, Oliver, he's still here. And the Renshaw twins, they run the inn. They all have blood on their hands, even if they don't know it." A cold dread settled over Anna. She knew those names. She'd met them in passing, exchanged pleasantries at the market, never realizing they were tied to the horrors buried beneath Evermore's surface. "They have to know," Anna whispered, a shiver running through her. "They have to face what they've done." Mrs. Kettle's face hardened. "You're playing with fire, girl. The dead don't forgive easily. And Margaret..." She trailed off, her eyes darkening. "Margaret's fury will consume anyone who stands in her way." Anna left the cottage with the old woman's words echoing in her ears, but she couldn't turn back now. The truth was out, and it was clawing its way through the fog, relentless and unforgiving. As she walked back through the mist, her breath visible in the cold air, the whispers began again, louder this time. "Find them!" Anna's pulse raced. She had no choice but to follow where the shadows of the past led her. The faces in the fog weren't just echoes of the dead. They were targets. And Margaret wasn't finished. The fog had only thickened by nightfall, curling in tendrils through the village streets, clinging to the rooftops like the breath of something unseen. Anna felt its weight as she made her way toward the inn where the Renshaw twins lived. The air was colder now, biting through her coat, but it wasn't just the weather that chilled her. Margaret was out there, waiting, watching. The whispers were everywhere, their soft, eerie hum rising and falling with each gust of wind. As she approached the inn, a flicker of movement caught her eye. A shadow in the fog, barely there, but it stopped her cold. The figure stood still, just beyond the reach of the inn's faint lights. It was Margaret, her pale form unmistakable, her dark hair blending with the mist. Anna's breath caught in her throat. Margaret's eyes were locked on the building, her expression unreadable, but the weight of her fury was palpable, hanging thick in the air. For a brief moment their eyes met. Anna froze, feeling the force of Margaret's anger surge toward her like a wave. She wanted to run, to flee back into the safety of her cottage, but something inside her held firm. Margaret's vengeance wasn't for her. Not yet. Without another glance, Margaret disappeared into the fog, her form melting away like smoke. Heart racing, Anna turned and hurried inside the inn. The warm air hit her like a wall, but it did nothing to ease the tension coiled in her chest. The inn was nearly empty, save for a few locals hunched over their drinks by the fire, their faces weary and drawn. Behind the counter, the Renshaw twins, Abigail and Amelia, moved about their tasks with quiet efficiency, their pale blonde hair identical, their expressions a mirror of calm. Anna hesitated, then approached the bar, The twins looked up, their sharp eyes settling on her with a strange, unreadable intensity. "Can I help you?" Abigail asked, her voice cool but polite. Anna swallowed, her mouth dry. "I need to talk to you. Both of you." Amelia, who had been wiping down the counter, paused mid-motion, her eyes flicking to her sister. "About what?" she asked, her tone cautious. Anna glanced around, lowering her voice. "About Margaret Hale." For a moment, neither of the twins reacted. Then, slowly, their expressions darkened, and they exchanged a look that sent a shiver down Anna's spine. "You shouldn't be asking about her," Abigail said quietly, her eyes narrowing. "That's all in the past. It has nothing to do with us." "It has everything to do with you," Anna said, her voice trembling but steady. "She's here. She's still here, and she's coming for the ones responsible." Amelia's hand tightened around the cloth she was holding, her knuckles white. "That's just a story," she whispered. "An old legend to scare people. Margaret Hale died a long time ago. She can't hurt anyone now." Anna shook her head. "You're wrong. She's already started. She wants revenge for what was done to her. And she's targeting those connected to the ones who wronged her. Your family. You're not safe." The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. For a long moment the twins didn't speak, their faces hard and unreadable. Then Abigail stepped forward, her voice low and urgent. "You need to leave," she said, her eyes flicking toward the windows. "If what you say is true, then you're in as much danger as we are. Margaret doesn't care who gets in her way." Anna's heart pounded in her chest. "I'm not leaving. We need to stop her before she—" A loud crash echoed from the back of the inn, cutting her off. The sound of something heavy hitting the floor, followed by a low, eerie creaking noise, filled the room. The other patrons glanced around uneasily, muttering to each other, but none of them moved. Anna's blood ran cold. The whispers had returned, swirling around her in a deafening crescendo. She could hear them in the walls, in the floorboards, growing louder with each passing second. "She's here," Anna whispered, her voice barely audible. The lights flickered, casting strange, dancing shadows on the walls. The fog outside seemed to thicken, pressing against the windows as if it were alive. And then, from the darkness at the back of the inn, a shape began to form. A figure, pale and shimmering, slowly emerging from the shadows. Margaret. Her eyes were fixed on the twins, her expression twisted with rage and sorrow. The air in the room grew colder, a frigid breath of death sweeping over them. Amelia backed away, her face pale, while Abigail stood frozen in place, her hands gripping the edge of the bar. "What do you want?" Abigail's voice trembled, but she didn't move. Margaret didn't speak. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes said everything. Justice. Revenge. Payment for a debt long overdue. Anna felt the weight of the spirit's presence, thick and oppressive, and she knew there was no stopping what was about to happen. The haunting had begun. The inn fell into a tense silence, thick with fear and the icy presence of the vengeful spirit. Margaret stood motionless, her ghostly figure hovering near the edge of the room, eyes fixed on the Renshaw twins. The room seemed to grow darker, as though the spirit were draining the very warmth and life from it. Anna, standing just feet away from the twins, felt her own breath catch, her skin prickling with the chill that emanated from the apparition. Abigail was the first to break the silence, her voice trembling. "Margaret, we didn't—" "You didn't what?" Anna cut in, her voice barely above a whisper, but laced with urgency. Didn't know? Didn't care? Margaret's ghost didn't move, but her presence was a weight that pressed down on them all, suffocating. The lights flickered again, and a gust of cold air swept through the room, even though the windows and doors remained shut. "We didn't do anything!" Amelia cried out, her voice panicked now. "It wasn't us, it was our ancestors! We had nothing to do with what happened to you!" Anna watched the spirit carefully, her heart pounding. Margaret's face, pale and shadowed, was unreadable, but the air around her seemed to crackle with barely contained fury. The twins' words hung in the air, desperate and pleading, but there was no sign of mercy in the spirit's cold gaze. "You're bound to them," Anna whispered, realizing the depth of the curse. "The bloodlines, the legacy. Margaret's vengeance isn't just for those who wronged her, it's for everyone tied to them." A sudden gust of wind slammed into the room, sending glasses crashing to the floor and knocking over chairs. The other patrons had fled long ago, leaving only Anna and the twins to face the spirit's wrath. The fog pressed hard against the windows now, as though it were alive, as if it wanted to devour the building whole. Anna stepped forward, her eyes locked on Margaret's ghostly form. "Margaret," she said, her voice steady despite the terror rising in her throat. "This won't bring you peace. The people who wronged you are long dead. What you're doing now, it won't end the suffering." Margaret's hollow eyes flicked toward Anna, just for a moment, and in them, Anna saw something unexpected. Pain. Deep, endless pain that had festered in death, twisting into something darker. The room seemed to vibrate with that pain, the walls groaning under the weight of it. "They lied to you," Anna continued, her voice soft but firm. "They buried you in an unmarked grave and erased you from history. But your name is spoken again, Margaret. I found your resting place. I know what they did to you, and I won't let them forget. We won't let them forget." The twins, huddled together now, trembled as Margaret's gaze shifted back to them. The room felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. Anna took another step forward, her eyes never leaving Margaret's. "Revenge won't set you free. It will only keep you bound here, restless in death. But if you stop now, if you let go, I'll make sure your story is told. I'll make sure they all know what was done to you." For a moment, nothing happened. The room remained deathly still, and Anna could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. Then, slowly, Margaret's form began to change. The edges of her figure blurred, becoming less solid, less defined. The cold air around them seemed to soften, just slightly, as though some of the weight had been lifted. The twins remained frozen, watching in terror, but Anna saw it, the moment when Margaret's rage wavered, just enough for something else to break through. The spirit's eyes, once filled with nothing but fury, softened with a sorrow so deep it was almost unbearable to witness. And then, with a whisper that seemed to echo through the very walls of the inn, Margaret spoke. "They took everything." The voice was barely more than a breath, but it held centuries of grief. The lights flickered one last time, and in that moment, Margaret's form seemed to dissolve into the air, like mist fading with the morning sun. The temperature in the room warmed slightly, and the fog outside began to thin, lifting just enough to reveal the outlines of the village beyond. Anna exhaled, her body shaking with the release of tension. The Renshaw twins were still huddled together, their faces pale and tear-streaked, but they were alive. Margaret had spared them. For now. The weight of what had happened settled over Anna like a heavy cloak. She knew Margaret's spirit wasn't fully at peace. Not yet. There were still those who needed to know her story, who needed to face the truth of what had been done. But the haunting, at least, was over. As Anna left the inn and stepped into the clearing fog, she felt the wind shift, gentler now, as though the village itself had taken a deep, relieved breath. Somewhere far beyond the fog, she imagined Margaret walking away from Evermore, her spirit no longer bound by the chains of vengeance. But as Anna glanced back at the dark, quiet inn, she couldn't help but wonder. Some spirits, she knew, never truly rest.